Okay, we should be live now. Let me just go ahead and let me just check the feed really quickly and just make sure that this is working correctly. Just give me 1 second. All right, and that should be going on. I'm not seeing it on here. Okay, I think it is working correctly now. Okay, great. Welcome. Okay, so we'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to join in. But as everyone is joining in, we're going to be just doing short little introductions. So with that being said, today, welcome to Quick Bible Facts, where we try to share quick Bible facts to help encourage you and to help you gain more knowledge about Christ and the Bible so you can actually have a stronger faith and help share it with others. With me, I have Mark Rasmussen. Mark and I have been leading Quick Bible Facts for a while and kind of been on this endeavor to share the gospel, share the truth with others. With that being said, we've kind of came across Dr. Wallace's research on the New Testament manuscripts, where he's done a bunch of research on this and has definitely helped strengthen my faith along with many other people in terms of trusting the New Testament manuscripts. Because if you're gonna believe the Bible, you have to also investigate, or you have to look into the trustworthiness of the New Testament manuscripts. With that being said, welcome to the show, Dr. Wallace.
Thank you, Dan and Mark. Appreciate it. You've been pursuing me for a long time when I've been traveling and getting sick, and thanks for being so dogged.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely. So you started csntm.org. So can you tell us a little bit about CSNTM? What's its mission? What are you actually doing at CSNTM?
It stands for the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Now, that's a mouthful. That's why we use the initials. But here's a way people can find it without even having to write it down. CSNTM, everybody should know who C.S. Lewis is. So you got the first two initials. And probably everybody has watched The Wizard of Oz, and you know who Auntie M is. CSM. There you go. So that should be a way to help you remember this. I started 19 years ago initially to try to get every single Greek New Testament manuscript in the world digitized. And so far, we've got about 40% of them done. We are posting these online for free forever for anybody to watch and to use. And scholars, we have scholars in, I think, 80 different countries that use this regularly and depend on our images to help them try to reconstruct the original wording of the New Testament.
Wow, that's so. How many manuscripts or how many pages have you guys actually photographed so far?
Let's see. I don't know that I've counted that up now. When I say we've got these 2,000 manuscripts on there, we've only photographed about 1,000 of those. And I initially started it with the hopes that other institutes would begin digitizing their own manuscripts, because I knew with 2.5 million pages of Greek New Testament manuscripts, we wouldn't be able to get that whole job done, at least not in my lifetime. So you've got major places, the Vatican, Oxford University, the British Library, places like that are digitizing their own. But our biggest mission was to photograph all 300 manuscripts at the National Library of Greece in Athens. And it took us 2 years. We had to raise $800,000. And we trained 44 people to be there, where we'd have 8 or 9 people there at a time, months on end. That was a big project, and we've got others lined up. We've done others since and before. 48 different places we've been in so far.
Wow, that's incredible. That's quite a journey. And the last question I would ask in part of the introduction is, what made you start capturing manuscript? What was your inclination to go after the New Testament manuscripts?
That's a great question. It had to do with an experience I had when I was 16 years old, growing up in Newport Beach, California. I'll need to keep this brief because I know there's a lot of things you want to talk about, and I've prepared just a few slides to go over some of these things. Sure. But I committed my life to Christ when I was 16. And I met a person who would sell me English New Testaments, paperback New Testaments, today's English version, for 25 cents a piece if I'd buy them by the box load. And so I thought, oh, great, I'll do that. And then this guy started telling me, well, look at this passage and this passage. Doesn't this prove that Jesus is not God? Well, I thought that he was. And so that got me into a pursuit to learn Greek, which I got at Biola University to start with, 4 years of Greek there. And I got another 14 semesters in my master's program at Dallas Seminary. And it got me to pursue grammar, Greek grammar, and textual criticism. And so those are my two big passions. I've written what's considered the standard intermediate advanced grammar on the Greek New Testament in the world today. It's been translated into, I think, half a dozen languages so far. And CSNTM is the other one to work on these manuscripts and reveal what we've got.
Well, we're definitely delighted and definitely thankful for your research. It's definitely made an impact in our lives. And I'm sure Mark has a lot to say there too. So we're definitely thankful for that. With that being said, I know we talk a lot about manuscripts, Dr. Wallace, and I know when I started off, I didn't know what is a manuscript. So I think that's very important for the audience to understand what is a manuscript. Could you shed some light there in terms of what that is? And if you would like me to enable your screen sharing, just let me know.
Okay, yeah, not yet. I don't have anything to share yet. Sure. But when we talk about manuscripts of the Bible, or at least of the New Testament, we are talking about handwritten documents before the time that the New Testament was published on a printing press. So that started in 1516. Now, we do have a few stragglers after that date, but they do not count as manuscripts if they're copies of a printed text. So most of them are earlier and far, far earlier than that. So a manuscript then is a handwritten document. And it's written, the earliest manuscripts are written on papyrus, kind of the ancient paper. Then they were written on parchment, animal skin, and several different kinds of animals were used. There's scientists who can determine exactly what kind of animal was used for a particular manuscript by seeing the pattern of the hair follicles in good digital images. Say, oh, this was a sheep, it may have come from this area, or this is a calf, those kinds of things. Just incredible. And then finally, manuscripts were written on paper. Early forms of paper, and those are the most fragile. They're even more fragile than the papyrus manuscripts.
Wow. Okay, so you're saying is that the early manuscripts, it's a handwritten copy. It was written on papyrus, and then it was written on parchment. And parchment is animal skin, so they take animal skin and they were able to actually use that as a form of paper.
Right, and that's correct. They did use paper after that.
And then they started using paper after that. Okay, that's great. So with that, so now that's great that we have a good understanding of what a manuscript is and how it was written. I think, could we move into a little bit on the codex and see what exactly is a codex? I see that word also being tossed around a bunch of times. So what is a codex?
Well, let me ask you first, Dan, how old are you?
So I'm 36.
Okay, well, you're kind of on the edge there, but let me explain a codex, because if there are some people in the audience who are under 30 or 32, something like that, they may have never seen one in their lives. A codex is a book that's bound on one side, and it has pages that you can turn and flip. It's got two covers, and it's what we call today a book. Now, if you're the younger generation, you don't even know what a book is. You do everything on your computer screen. And the way you find something to read is you scroll. Now, scrolling through a document, that's what it was called, a scroll or a roll, that was pre-codex book form. And so younger generation people have gone retro on us, and they're using the scroll instead of the codex. But for most, if you actually carry a Bible instead of put it in your iPhone, you know what a codex is.
That's a wonderful way to put it, Dr. Wallace. So basically, you're saying a codex is basically something like this: is bound, has the pages in between. That's what a codex is, right?
Right.
And then a leaf is actually a single page. Is that what the leaf is also?
Well, leaf is it's both pages, the front and back. So you might have that's called the leaf or a folio. Page is just one side. And then you have what's called a quire, Quire, where you have 8 bifolios bound together, the sewn in the middle on all hardback books. That's how they were done until fairly recently. And what was started in the early medieval era is still done today for hardback books. We learned it back then from the 3rd century, and we're still doing the same thing.
Very interesting.
So seeing the sewing in the middle of your spine, on some of the pages when they start falling apart, not paperbacks, they're glued together. But on hardbacks, they're sewn or have been usually. That goes back to the 3rd century.
Wow.
Second century, actually.
That's fascinating. So early, so kind of so it seems like from the very beginning, it kind of started off as scrolls where people would actually roll up the paper, which was parchment or papyrus, something of that nature. And then that kind of progressed its way towards a codex, and they started piecing everything together. And then we get a bound book that kind of like what we have today. And that's called a codex. Is that a good summary?
That's accurate. But what's interesting is most people don't realize that although Christians did not invent the codex, they were certainly the first ones to popularize it. And we know it was invented in probably the second half of the 1st century AD. Our earliest copy of a codex is actually from the New Testament in the 2nd century, and it's a scrap of papyrus number 52. But all of the New Testament books were originally written on a roll or a scroll, but we have no copies of the New Testament written on a scroll, except if it's on the backside of another scroll that was like Homer on one side, because on a scroll, you only write on the inside. You would write on the backside. And John talks about that in Revelation, where he says this was written on the front and the back as if it were unusual because it was a scroll. And then he talks about the 7-sealed book. And what he means by a book is a scroll, because if you have a codex and you want to get to the 7th seal, you want to find out who done it, the last page of the mystery novel, or you could just go right to the last page. Right. And you have in a scroll is you roll open some, and then you have to cut open the wax that seals the next section. And so you have to go section by section. You can't cheat and look at the last page, but on a codex you could. So even John writing the last book of the New Testament wrote on a scroll.
Wow. Okay. No, that's new knowledge to me. That's awesome. That's great that you share that. So we kind of covered manuscripts. We covered the codex. How about variants? Dr. Wallace, can you shed some light on what is a variant?
Yeah, let me explain what a variant is. And I think you want to ask about textual variants, how many there are, whether there are any among our manuscripts.
Sure. Absolutely, yeah. So let's start off with what is a variant, and then maybe we could talk about maybe if there are any variants in the New Testament. So let's start with the definition, maybe.
A textual variant means any variation in wording between at least 2 manuscripts. And a variant is considered if you have any spelling differences, any word order differences. You have different tenses, omission of words, addition of words, transposition, substitution. All these are variants. And so what doesn't count is capitalization or punctuation, because originally all the letters were capital and there were no word spaces, spaces between the words, and no punctuation. So that makes it hard for us to read today, but back then, that's how they read it.
Okay, so you're saying that, for example, if you have a specific word order, right, and it's changed from the right to the left, that would be counted as a variant.
Correct.
Okay, if there's a spelling difference, for example, if my name was Daniel and the E and the I were switched out, that would be called a variant.
Yes, that's correct.
And then
even if it makes no sense, even if it's a misspelling, those are all counted as variants.
Those are all kind of, and the way you compare that is between the manuscripts. That's what you just said, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So with that being said, are there any variants in the New Testament manuscripts?
Yeah, there are quite a few. And let me add one other thing about what a variant is and how it's counted. This is an important thing because evangelicals have held to a misunderstanding of how to count variants. I'll give you an actual example. In John chapter 4, verse 1, it says either when Jesus knew what the Pharisees had said, or when the Lord knew. So it's either the Lord knew or Jesus. It's never Peter or John. It's just the Lord or Jesus. That's a textual variant between those two. Now, we have quite a few manuscripts that have the Lord in them, and some manuscripts have Jesus. So if you start with a base text that says, one manuscript says Jesus, and you have, let's say, 1,000 manuscripts that have Lord there, and there are more than 1,000 manuscripts that have the word Lord there, that doesn't mean it's 1,000 variants. It's one variant attested 1,000 times. And there has been a misunderstanding by evangelicals going back for 50 years that, well, it's the multiplication of how many witnesses you have to the different wording that counts as variants. That's not true. So that's an important clarification to get, because there's been apologist after apologist who has stated it incorrectly because they were not looking at what textual critics were saying and who were doing the counting.
That's a very important point. Okay, so how many manuscripts? Okay, got it. So we got the word order. We understood what the variants are. Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. Now, in terms of manuscript evidence, right? There's a lot of other ancient literature that's out there as well.
You asked another question prior to that. Let me get that I didn't get to yet. That is, do we have any textual variants among the manuscripts? I just gave you an example from John 4:1, where it's one variant, but 1,000 times plus probably 1,500 manuscripts that have the word Lord there. But yes, there are textual variants in the Greek New Testament manuscripts, and I think I have a few slides to show you on this now. So if you could switch on to my keynote presentation.
There you go.
Okay. So the question is, how many textual variants are there in the Greek New Testament manuscripts? Well, let's start with the words in the New Testament. I'm talking about the Greek New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, and we have approximately 138,162 words. Now, that's kind of what you have in the standard scholarly constructed text of the New Testament. How many variants do we have among the manuscripts with that? Well, this is, I think, to scale. You see the red line there? Does that show up on the screen?
Yes, we see the red line. Yes.
Okay. That comes out to approximately 1.5 million variants in the manuscripts. So we've got 10 times as many variants as we have words in the New Testament. That should be encouraging news to all Christians, right? They say, how in the world can I get back to the original? Well, let me give you some of the statistics on this. The reason that we have a lot of textual variants is that we have a lot of manuscripts. 300 years ago, a man by the name of Richard Bentley, who was a professor at Cambridge University, wrote a book in 1713 defending a man who 6 years earlier had published the first collation of manuscripts where he listed the variants. He looked at 99 Greek manuscripts, readings from church fathers and ancient translations, and he produced, it took him his entire scholarly life, and he produced a work that had 30,000 textual variants in it. Now, there were some Protestants who were saying this is the work of the devil. And I would say historical investigation is never the work of the devil. That's what we are methodologically commanded to do by Jesus' example, because he became flesh in time, space, history. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that the tomb was empty. 500 people at one time, brothers and sisters, saw him alive. And he said, and most of these are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. He's talking about actual historical evidence, not just a belief that has no basis. So Christianity is not a myth, and historical investigation is crucial to it. A friend of mine has said that our faith is shrouded in mystery, but it's also grounded in history. And I think that's a good balance to have. So here's what Bentley said about these 30,000 variants that John Mill came up with. Some Protestants were against it, said this is the work of the devil. And before I show you Bentley's quote, Catholics were just excited about this. They were saying, you Protestants have a paper pope, and he's got footnotes. And, he's got disagreements with himself. Ours is speaking ex cathedra. So Bentley says in 1713, he was one of the most important scholars on the New Testament text, actually in the last 300 or 400 years, in the last 400 years at least. If there had been but one manuscript of the Greek New Testament at the restoration of learning about 2 centuries ago, he's talking about when the first published Greek New Testament came off the printing presses in 1516. Then we would have no various readings at all. Various readings is a variant. And would the text be in a better condition then than now that we have 30,000 variant readings? He's saying, of course not. It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. So he's saying the more manuscripts, the more variants, the better we can access the original wording by comparing these manuscripts. So let me give you kind of a list of an embarrassment of riches to show this. And I suspect we could compare this to, I think you started to ask about how the New Testament compares to other ancient literature. Is that right?
Yeah. So are there any variants in the New Testament? But also, it'd be great. It kind of comes right in from variants. We can start off with how many manuscripts do we actually have for the New Testament?
Yeah, and how that compares to other ancient literature. And
Sure,
keep in mind the variants in light of this. So the official number, I think, is now 5,898 Greek New Testament manuscripts.
Okay.
A manuscript could be as small as a small scrap of papyrus or a complete New Testament, but we count those if they are different documents. Go ahead.
So you're saying a manuscript could be a single sheet. A manuscript can also be a complete codex. Would this be considered one manuscript?
Yes.
Okay, so got it. Okay, cool.
It's written because a single fragment of a leaf would have come from a codex. But we don't have that whole codex, so what we count is still that. But the average Greek New Testament manuscript is over 400 pages long. So that tells you, yeah, we do have some that are small fragments, but most of them are very, very large. And the New Testament started to get translated into Latin in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and Latin became the lingua franca of Western Europe. So we have more manuscripts in Latin than we do in Greek. We don't know how many, but the probably the best estimate is about 10,000 of the New Testament. Then the New Testament was also translated into other ancient languages like Syriac and Coptic, Old Church Slavonic, Gothic, Georgian, Armenian, and Aramaic, and even Hebrew. The best estimates are somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 manuscripts in these other ancient versions, and the size of them is still about 400 pages on average. So you put all this together, you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, handwritten manuscripts.
So can we pause right there?
A lot of them.
So right over there, you hit on a very, very important point. So you're saying that we have about 20,000 manuscripts for the New Testament. And the average size of those manuscripts is about 400 pages.
Right.
That's
a lot of data. It is. Now, if you had a magic wand and could erase all of this data, we could still reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament from the writings of the church fathers alone. Now, I don't mean just the early church fathers, but the church fathers who wrote throughout history. And these people did not have the gift of brevity. We have over 1 million quotations by the church fathers counted so far. We haven't gone very far in the count. There's a place in Germany that has been counting this for decades, almost a millennium, I think. I mean, not a millennium, a century. Sorry, wrong word. That's a texture variant, by the way, on century and millennium. Definitely wrong. So we could reconstruct virtually the whole New Testament just from the writings of the church fathers alone. That's really amazing. So let's compare that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So at that time, you had church fathers that were writing, right? They were writing themselves. So if we were to lose all of the New Testament manuscripts, we can virtually nearly create the New Testament again just by their writings and their references.
And we could virtually recreate the whole many times over. We don't know how many times over we could do it. The work has not been completed yet. That's still just a massive project.
You know, the first question that comes to my mind, Dr. Wallace, is why were they so adamant? What was their driving force to write and copy and distribute so many copies of the New Testament?
They wanted to get the gospel out. They wanted to feed the church to help Christians grow in their faith, because Christianity and Judaism are the only religions in the world that are so strongly textually based. And on top of that, we have a resurrected king. That makes Christianity unique among all the other religions. Well, let me compare this to other classical writers.
Sure.
If you compare the New Testament to the average classical work, Greek or Latin, the average classical Greek writer has fewer than 15 copies of his work still in existence. And I think that's more than the average Latin writer has. And if you stack them up, they're about 4 feet high. Now, what about the New Testament? Well, let me give it in terms of a visual representation. I had to put in the word a podium for this picture because many of you who are under 30 would not recognize that thing. Or if you've been learning virtually, then you don't know what a podium is anymore. So that's what we'll use for the classical author, the average classical author. What should we use for the New Testament? How about the Empire State Building? And if you're from Arkansas, I need to add, that's in New York City, because you didn't know that's where it was. Arkansas is, a suburb of Texas. So anyway, we'd like to make fun of them. Okay, so let's get this to scale. The average classical work, that pixel there is about 4 feet tall comparatively. And I worked this out to scale about as closely as I could. The Empire State Building is 1,454 feet tall. So you got that dot down there, and it's 1,454 feet tall. But look, I haven't filled up the page here. That wouldn't be the whole New Testament. You take all the manuscripts of the New Testament. I'm sorry, I went backwards on the slide. Both in Greek and the ancient versions, but not counting the quotations in the church fathers. I have no idea how to count that. Here's what you'd have. You'd have 4.5 Empire State Buildings stacked up on top of each other. That's the stack of New Testament manuscripts. The average classical author, size of a podium. It would be more than 1.25 miles high, not counting church fathers' quotations. That's called an embarrassment of riches. So
that indeed is an embarrassment of riches. So you're saying we have so many manuscripts that will stack up more than 3-4 Empire State Buildings versus the average Greek one, which is less than 4 feet tall, or about 4 feet tall.
Right.
Wow.
That's right. And then if you take Homer, the most prolific writer in terms of the copies we have of his writings, prolifics, I'm sorry, not the right word, but Homer, he was copied more than anybody else. He's got a 900-year head start on the New Testament manuscripts. And Alexander had his copy of Homer's writings with him all the time. I mean, everybody, that was what they were trained on in grade school. They read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So even with a 900-year head start, he is the most copied classical author of all. And the numbers of manuscripts of Homer are less than 2,000.
So you're saying
2,000 versus 20 to 25,000. That's the most highly copied author of the classical world.
So in the classical world, we have Homer with about 2,000 manuscripts versus the New Testament, which stacks up to about 20,000 manuscripts. And that's the most that we have for Homer, right? There's nobody else.
Right. And about 1,800 of those are fragmentary papyri. I do not think the average size manuscript of Homer is 400 pages. It's probably a whole lot less, but there's only one person in the world I know who would perhaps know that off the top of his head.
And then one last question over here, Dr. Wallace. For Alexander the Great, approximately how many manuscripts do we have for him?
Well, you're talking about different historians on Alexander the Great, and
Okay,
I think the best historian lived. I don't have the exact data on that. There's so many authors you have to think through, but uh,
sure.
the best historian in terms of reliable record comes long, long time after Alexander lived, and the earliest copies of those come hundreds of years later. So we're talking about something that's probably, I think, 200 years after he lived, 150 years for our earliest copies. That's just mind-boggling when you think about that, compared to the Gospels written within decades of Jesus' life. And
Okay, so
people
just
say
to sum,
the Gospels can't be accurate, and because we're waiting for such a long time before we get copies, and they were written so late, they've never done any comparisons with this.
that's a good point. So just to summarize real quick, so you're saying for the New Testament, we have about 20,000 manuscripts versus ancient Greek literature, which stacks up to about only 4 feet high, which the most that we have for any person is Homer, which is about 2,000 versus about
Right.
20,000. And then the time gap in between is a lot larger versus the time gap for the New Testament manuscripts.
Exactly.
Okay,
In
got it.
fact, we can say for Xenophon's Hellenica, which is Xenophon was one of the great ancient authors. He, if you look at his Hellenica, you only have fragments of manuscripts coming maybe 500 years after. But before we get any substantive copies of Xenophon, it's 1,800 years after he wrote. If that were the case with the New Testament, we'd say by the time we get a whole copy of Romans or one of the Gospels, it'd be about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. So that's what the comparison should be if skeptics are going to have any kind of argument about the Bible.
Okay. Now, if we circle right back around to the variants in the New Testament, do we have variants, or could you shed just a little bit of light on there for the New Testament manuscript for the variants?
Yeah. Let me. You about the nature of the variants? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, here's a statement from Kurt Eichenwald. I won't read the whole thing because of time, but these skeptics always come out at Christmas or Easter. And he wrote an article called "The Bible So Misunderstood It's a Sin." Actually, I will read this whole thing, but I'm going to summarize my critique of it. Playing telephone with the Word of God. No television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope, and neither have I. So far, I think he's probably telling the truth. And neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation, a translation of translations of translations of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on, hundreds of times. Well, he gets this from certain skeptical scholars, genuine scholars, and he has played the telephone game with what they've written. In other words, he doesn't even come close to representing them accurately. The New Testament is not like the telephone game. If I had more time, I could tell you more about it. But you'd have not just one line of copy, and it's not just verbally. It's not meant to be a parlor game that causes people to intentionally get them to have a garbled message. And you can interview people all along the stream, several different streams. So you can talk to the second and third generation people and get the message. You'd be able to figure out what the original story was doing that, if it were written documents in particular. So here's another way to look at it. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times we don't know what it originally said? King James Bible was basically based on 8 Greek New Testament manuscripts. The earliest came from the 11th century. Today we have over 5,500, and the earliest come from the 2nd century. That's a huge difference. So if I were just to show you by century, I'm going to have to go through this real quickly. But within the first 200 years, there are more New Testament manuscripts than we have of the average Greco-Roman author in 2,000 years. And by the end of the first millennium, we have at least 967 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0. It's an embarrassment of riches for sure.
That's incredible.
So the bottom line is, as we go on, we're getting closer and closer to the original.
So it seems.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You asked about nature variants, but you probably want to summarize what I just said a little bit.
Right. So you're saying is that there's just so much evidence for manuscript evidence for the New Testament. It just doesn't even compare to any other ancient literature out there, which raises so many questions like why were they willing or what was their driving force? And you kind of hinted on that earlier just before that. So it's interesting to see. It's actually fascinating to see that we have so much evidence, and it really is, like you put it, an embarrassment of riches when we're trying to make a solid case for the reliability and the trustworthiness of the New Testament.
Right, right. And of course, then the question turns on what's the nature of these variations, textual variations. And so if I could just show you a few slides on that, this would, I think this is pretty significant here. So over 99% of them make virtually no difference at all. I'm talking about the 1.5 million variants, all right? Over 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, there are differences in spelling. And I spelled the word spelling incorrectly. Sorry about that. For those in Arkansas, they didn't catch the mistake, but nevertheless, that would be a difference. But here's a question that I have for any Greek geeks that are watching this right now. How many ways do you think there are to say John loves Mary in Greek? Now, this will show up on the quiz afterwards, so you need to write all these down. Keep in mind, there's word order differences in Greek. There's the Greek article with proper names, the word the, translated as the often. And it occurs with the John loves the Mary, or both can have it, both can lack it, one can have it, one can lack it. We still don't know why exactly. And then there's differences in spelling, like the name for John could be spelled with 2 N's in the middle or not, Ioannis or Ioannis, and we'll always get that in the manuscripts. So I'm going to show you how many ways you can say John loves Mary in Greek. Here's 8 ways, and another 8, and more. Because of time, we'll have to go through this quickly because otherwise it'd give you time to copy all these down. 96 ways. These are all different ways to say John loves Mary in Greek, using the same word for love. The only difference in meaning would be the slight emphasis on John loves Mary, or John loves Mary, or John loves Mary. That's it. Now, if you add certain conjunctions that are often untranslated, you get a number more, and this goes up to 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Now, on top of that, other legitimate word orders and constructions swell the numbers to over 1,000. And you add a different verb for loves, and it mushrooms the numbers to more than 2,000. That is amazing to think about that. That's the kind of variance we're typically dealing with. Now, Bart Ehrman said we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the text of the New Testament came to be changed. And he says the examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Well, that's true, but the vast majority of them are this kind. And so that doesn't really make any sense to us. It doesn't. It's not significant that you have 1.5 million variants. What's significant is those that are affecting the nature. And so that's getting to the real nub of the question here. Do you want to summarize before I get into this?
Right. So you used an example, John loves Mary, and you showed that you can actually write John loves Mary 96 different ways. And all those 96 different ways of writing John love Mary, if it was found in different manuscripts, would be counted as a variant?
Yes.
Even though it has, okay, so even though it has the same meaning?
Yes.
Okay. So that kind of shows in terms of the types of variants that we have. Now, I think you're kind of going to hint on this. What are the majority types of variants, or what are the groups of the variants?
Well, I've liked to group them by whether they are viable, which means they could go back to the original wording. They've got some case on the basis of the manuscript evidence, not found in just a couple of late manuscripts. It could, scholars can look at this and say, I can see how these manuscripts could have the original wording on the basis of historical evidence and historical reconstructions. And the other issue is, okay, it's viable, but is it meaningful? And so if you look at this chart I've put together, when you look at these four categories: viable and meaningful, not viable but meaningful, not meaningful but viable, or not viable or not meaningful, either one. The only category that is significant is those that are both meaningful and viable. And that's less than 1%. In fact, it's less than 1/10 of 1% of all textual variants fit that group. So that's pretty significant when you think about the nature. You get the numbers and you just get overwhelmed. But you think about the nature of these variants, and we're right back where Richard Bentley was. It's not significant.
So here's a question for you, Dr. Wallace. So out of these variants, you said about 1.5 million variants. Do any of these impact any essential doctrine?
That's really the bottom line question, isn't it? Does our faith depend on a textual variant about the virgin birth or the deity of Christ or salvation by faith alone or the resurrection? And I'm going to just illustrate this with just one passage, and that's John 1:1, where it says, this is papyrus number 66, written about AD 200. We're not exactly sure. Originally, it was dated about 150. Maybe it's a little later than 200. But this is a really important old manuscript of John's Gospel. And it starts out just like every other manuscript of John's Gospel says in any language. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, here we have our oldest manuscript on that, and that's incredible. But then you've got another old manuscript, P75, that recently was somehow donated apparently to the Vatican. Yale University wanted to buy this. They wanted to offer $50 million for this papyrus, and it's got parts of Luke and John. And it says exactly the same thing at John 1:1. This is written about 250, something like that. Then you've got... go ahead.
Just real quick. So the papyrus that you're showing right now, right before this, that was from John, and that's John 1:1. And what language is
Luke
that?
And beginning of John, yeah.
So,
I'm sorry?
So what language is this? Is this Greek? Is that what's written? Okay, so that's the Greek from then, John 1:1, that was written about 8200 or 8250, and that's the same thing that we have in our Bible today. So we can actually look at the manuscript then and then know what was written in our Bible today. It has the same exact meaning.
Exactly. And there's a lot of myths about the creation of the New Testament and how doctrines may have changed. So many people believe Constantine in the 4th century invented the deity of Christ. Well, unless he was about 175 years old, I don't think he could have done that, because he would have had to write P66 or known about it. But, you've got the deity of Christ clearly stated long before Constantine lived. Then here's a 4th century manuscript, says exactly the same thing. Another one that may be 4th or 5th century. And here's a one that's early 5th century. It just goes on and on and on. And I can say this: every single manuscript of John's Gospel, no matter the date or the language, says virtually the same thing in John 1:1. Jesus is unequivocally called God. And the same could be said for the major passages that affirm Christ's deity, his birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, his second coming, and all this could go on and on. There is, in fact, not a single cardinal doctrine that is jeopardized by any textual variant.
That is so reassuring, and that's so nice to know that even though there's so many variants, no essential doctrine has been jeopardized. And it's really interesting to see the manuscripts that you just shown from the 2nd and the 4th century displaying John 1:1, and that's the same meaning that we have in our Bible today. So when someone comes to you and says, "Oh, it's been lost in translation," the manuscript from then, what was written then, has been changed over time, and now you got a different version of the Bible. But that's so far away from the truth, where you can actually go to csntm.org and pull up some of these manuscripts, read the Greek for yourself, and compare it with the Bible in your hand, and you can be rest assured that the meaning has been preserved accurately.
I was at a library in former Soviet bloc country, where there were Muslims who worked in the library, and they would bring out these manuscripts for us to digitize. And there was this one young Muslim man whose name was Isa, or Jesus, is what it is. And every time he brought me out a manuscript of the Gospels, I'd open it up to John 1:1 and it'd say, "This says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God," like every single other manuscript you've brought out here. And I didn't even need to see it ahead of time. I'd open it up, said exactly the same thing.
That's incredible. So what about the dates? Can we talk about that a little bit? What is the date of the oldest complete New Testament that we have today?
That would be Codex Sinaiticus. Let me switch back to that image.
Sure.
This is a manuscript that was discovered in 1859 at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. And this manuscript was originally a complete Bible, Old and New Testament, all written in Greek. Very, very large manuscript written on a decent parchment. And here's the leaf that has John 1:1 right at the very beginning. It goes a little bit on farther into John's Gospel. The scribes who put this together did it in 4 columns. It's the only 4-column Bible we have, but this manuscript was written in the middle of the 4th century, about AD 350. And this manuscript is to this day the oldest complete New Testament that we have, discovered 150 years ago. We don't have another complete New Testament for 500 years. That is complete in our hands today. There were several New Testaments that were complete. I'm sure there were at least 100 of them made. And we have 4 that were originally complete, but we know that, but we have portions of it. This is the only one that is still completely complete of the whole New Testament from the 4th century.
So
very significant manuscript.
Okay, so from the 4th century, we have a complete New Testament, and that's the page that you're showing from that manuscript right now.
Right.
Okay, got it.
And so it's essentially the same of all the other manuscripts. I do have a final quote I want to show you at the end just to kind of lay this out. But, there are going to be these variants, and some of them are meaningful. But what do they affect? Things like Jesus versus Lord. Some are more important than that, of course, but they don't affect any essential beliefs, not a single one.
That's definitely reassuring to know that none of these variants actually impact any of the New Testament documents. Well, I think that just about wraps up the questions that we had for you here today, Dr. Wallace. And just to summarize real quickly, we learned about what is a manuscript, which was discussed earlier in the program. And then we went from a manuscript into a codex, basically what we have in our hand today, which is called a book. That's a codex. and then we went into variants, and then we saw that there are some variants, and there are actually about 1.5 million variants, but none of those variants impact any essential document, right? And then we also looked at the amount of New Testament manuscripts versus the amount of manuscripts from ancient literature. And the New Testament has by far the most, equaling to about 20,000 to about only 2,000 for Homer's Iliad, right? Or just for Homer himself, or has the most, and which is about 2,000. So there's a vast difference there. And also, which makes the case a little bit stronger for the New Testament, is the time gap in between from the time the event happened from the time frame of when it was actually written. So that's also a huge uniqueness of the New Testament versus any other ancient literature out there. And then lastly, I think, which was very important, was there is no textual variant that impacts any essential doctrine. So the death, deity, and resurrection of Jesus Christ has been preserved. So Jesus died on the cross by crucifixion. He rose from the dead 3 days later. And that is very self-assuring to know that our faith is grounded in objectivity.
Right. You've summarized it well. You're a good listener.
You explain well, Dr. Wallace.
Well, thank you for for the questions, and it was a great privilege to be on your show tonight.
Absolutely. So it was great having you on here today. We'll definitely try to do something more, something like this later on in the future, where we can go ahead and take some more questions from the audience, and then just dive a little bit deeper into the New Testament documents. You summarized it incredibly well. The manuscript that you showed here today was definitely very helpful. I will be uploading this on YouTube, so then other people can actually use it and learn from it and help grow their faith.
All right, great, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.